Logan's ready. Everybody knows who everybody else is. Everyone's welcome. Yay, Prime Minister.
From our side of the house, we do not believe that this plan will go about solving every single problem or solving every single terrorist organization. But we believe in two things. Firstly, we believe that this would bring about a more effective measure in taking care of the Japanese citizens themselves. And secondly, we think that this will help better in the war on terrorism as another willing actor that's willing to fight against these terrorist organizations. And those are the goals that we believe will happen by taking this proposal that benefits. We think that the Article 9 in the first place was something that was created based on public sentiment right after the Second World War, when Japan didn't like the atomic bombs being dropped, when Japan supported peace, or when Japan wanted a peaceful world in general. But recognizing how the world in itself has changed, how it has become a lot more glum, and how terrorism has gone up, how conflict has gone up throughout the world, and how we now have ISIS, and when Japan itself has now been targeted by this area, and when there is an active threat towards Japan, now more than ever, when we have the two hostages, Irina Yukawa and Kenji Goto, who is now being killed by ISIS, when Japan had no way to retaliate against this, when Japan's negotiation tactics didn't work, and Japan had to just sit and watch them being killed, and we now have no way to go back against ISIS because we have no active measure to go against. We think that each state has a right to defend itself, and a right to fight back, and a right to protect its citizens as a principle to start with. We don't necessarily think this principle is dependent on whether that's necessarily going to be effective or not, but we think as a fundamental principle, each state has that right to defend itself in the first place. We need to understand firstly what these international terrorist organizations are. We think that this debate is mainly centered around the ISIS, the biggest threat right now, right? We think that we need to recognize these organizations are organizations where negotiations do not necessarily work, where they already have a big military power, which they have the ability to bully other countries with, and they are the ones, even if negotiations did happen, they are the ones who are creating the demands, and all the negotiations are based on their demands, i.e. what happened with the Jordanian pilot and the trying to release him in order for the conflict that the Jordan has and so on and so forth, right? I think that we need to recognize that Japan is in a unique position where they cannot protect the citizens of the Japanese citizens without having an active army. And there is no way to retaliate against these terrorist organizations as well without having an army itself. We think that this is unfair just because of a historical reason, when firstly the playing field itself has changed throughout the years, and secondly when the public sentiment itself has changed, and when the public are really wanting retaliation, when the public are pissed at the Japanese government for not being able to do anything about it, and not being able to retaliate just because of this simple reason. I think it rather becomes a problem when you really don't allow the governments to defend itself as a nation and also the citizens of that nation. We think that this then goes on to rather delegitimize that government itself, because firstly, obviously you cannot protect your citizens now, and secondly, you do not have a legitimate way to retaliate against these organizations. You are now just being targeted without having a good response. We think that even in international terms as well, we believe that military assistance and the capacity to provide military personnel is one of the prerequisites to really have a say in how the discourse is going to go about and how plans are going to be provided in order to tackle these international problems. And that by allowing Japan's rearmament and by giving them another army that they can use in order to tackle these organizations, it rather also increases the political capability of Japan as a nation in order to go about tackling these problems. On a comparison with what we actually do right now, Japan provides money, but money itself only goes so far. Because firstly, there's already an international condemnation towards Japan, that Japan doesn't necessarily help that much, that Japan is taking the backstab just by taking money, sending money, and not necessarily taking the risks of sending their own troops as well. But secondly, in cases when negotiations do not work, the actual cases of these organizations and what actually happened with the two hostages, there is no other way for Japan to now retaliate, right? And therefore we think that an active measure is going to be necessary. But thirdly, when you consider how the public perception has changed, when public really wants protection, and when public are really pissed at not being able to really have that change in direction, we think it becomes problematic just by having monetary aid, and we think that it's necessary for Japan to be able to take the next step. Yes?
Australia's involvement in the war on terror has made Australia an active recruiting ground for ISIS and increased the resentment towards Australia. Why will the same thing not happen towards Japan?
Number one, the resentment towards Japanese government is already happening to an extent. We already see Japanese citizens trying to escape to ISIS, and the Japanese government is trying to prevent that. The reason why that's happening is because they don't see Japan as being a capable actor in trying to defend themselves, and they don't necessarily see Japan as being a legitimate government in the first place. So we think that on a comparison, so we think that by being able to provide that protection measure in the first place, it would, on a comparison with the status quo, you would firstly be able to change the public sentiment, make the government look as if they're doing something, and make them look as if they're actually trying to solve the problem. And we think that that's more going to be catering towards the government, towards the public itself. We think that's what like democracy should be all about, not necessarily base it on public sentiment 60 years ago, but rather base it on the public sentiments of the people right now. We think that even if we were to go about doing this proposal, even if Japan were to rearm, we don't necessarily think that possible harms are going to occur, i.e. like the harms in the Northeast Asian region and so on and so forth, right? We don't necessarily think that Japan are going to be bullying other nations, because you can already see strong economic ties that's already like existing within the region itself. And moreover, you have the US to check and balance the extent that Japan goes on to really like become belligerent and so on. So we don't necessarily think that's necessarily going to be a problem. But more on how Japan is going to be perceived by the international arena now. I think that this now finally gives the ability for Japan to prove itself as actually being a peaceful actor. When you necessarily see, when you recognize how Japan has been considered and Japan has been seen by the nations within the region, i.e. South Korea, i.e. China, that see Japan as still being like belligerent, still having the will to try and conquer them, and so on. The only reason that they still have that fear, and the only reason that they say Japan is still going to do so, and the reason Japan is not doing so right now, is because Japan doesn't necessarily have an army. The moment you give Japan the army, and the moment you give Japan the ability to prove itself against other nations by saying, no, we're not necessarily going to be as belligerent as ever, but we are going to be the peaceful actor. I think that this also increases the cooperation within the Northeast Asian region. I think that's going to be much better. But all in all, we think that when you recognize how public sentiment has existed, and how public sentiment has now changed after the executions of Hiromi and Keiji Goto, and when you consider how public sentiment is now wanting this to happen, we think this is something important, and this is something we wholeheartedly support.
7:05. Thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister. And we call the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, the stance coming from style opposition is that this is a horrible, horrible strategy and idea coming from the Japanese government. We're going to prove to you 3 things in my speech today. Number 1, why there's no clear threat of ISIS or terrorism coming to Japan for now. Secondly, why this policy makes it extremely, extremely more dangerous for Japanese people, both in terms of security and in terms of political aspect. Lastly, why that side of the house freezes diplomatic relationship and provides negative consequences for Northeast Asia in general. All of these arguments will directly clash against UP's material, so rebuttals will be integrated. First argument, why there's no clear threat in terms of to the extent that you wage war and go on a revenge towards ISIS. First of all, we say on a very, very simple level, Japan is located in East Asia, which means that there's no regional proximity for those Middle Eastern countries or Muslim fundamentalist terrorists to begin with. But secondly, in terms of religious aspects, as to why the reason why this terror happened is because of Muslim fundamentalism. Japanese people don't have much Muslim population to begin with, and the only instances of Japanese abduction regarding Goto Genji and Yukawa that they mentioned and that they wanted to retaliate on, Yukawa was abducted because he he was arms dealer in that region, Mr. Speaker. And you know what? Like when he was abducted and killed because he was arms dealer in that region, now what happens when you wage war against ISIS is that you will have more Japanese people abducted. You will have more Japanese security being threatened under that side of the house. But moreover, if, like there were some other people, like for example, like Hoto Genji was a war photographer, Mr. Speaker, in that region, are being threatened and being abducted, Mr. Speaker, we said this is not an exclusive problem and this is not an exclusive solution coming from side opposition. Because like when your civilian is being threatened and when you are a war photographer, for example, a journalist, then you can ask any of your allies to utilize their troops under request to protect your civilian and go on a mission to that. So we don't think that Japan has to wage war against ISIS or any nation to protect their civilians. But moreover, we say that like you lose deniability towards war involvement. Therefore, there's more reason of ISIS to kill war photographers from Japan right now. Because right now, what Japan and Korea are doing is that they don't have direct involvement militarily with ISIS and like aiding like US in killing off ISIS people. That's why Japan and South Korea have diplomatic deniability in telling those like terrorist fundamentalist organizations that they should not kill their people, that they should not abduct their citizens, where they're destroying exactly that rhetoric and that political capital, which makes it extremely more dangerous for Japanese people. Second argument, Mr. Speaker, why this is extremely more dangerous for Japanese security and Japanese civilians in general. I'm going to first talk about the security issues. Like this, as I've briefly mentioned in my rebuttal as well, like expands the targets of abduction to Japan and expands terrorism in that Japanese territory and Japanese embassy. So now, what will happen in that Middle East, in Middle East nations, Japanese embassy will be direct targets because they are militarily involved into combating terrorism. And like you increase resentment against Japanese governments. Like you lose deniability into saying that like giving up political capital to not abduct your citizens, to not kill your citizens, because once you opt into retaliating and opt into active warfare, Mr. Speaker, then like now these terrorist organizations recognize Japanese civilian government as their direct enemy, and it would be strategically more easier for them to abduct Japanese civilians and threaten Japanese government for that matter. We saw this exactly happening in Australia when they Australia is one of the most cleanest regions regarding terror, but when they started getting involved directly militarily in Iraq and Afghanistan warfare, aiding US militarily, it may increase resentment regarding Australia and like significantly increase the amount of guerrilla warfare happening within Australia, becoming a political capital to utilize and recruit terrorist members in that land, Mr. Speaker. We think same thing will happen for Japan. That's horrible idea for Japanese security. Disprove it.
Japan has already waged war on ISIS by giving a lot of money to, for example, Egypt and so on.
We think number one, providing money is fine. That's different because that's not going against the Constitution right now. But moreover, money is a more comprehensive issue, Mr. Speaker. When you provide money, they don't directly give that money to military. You send like reconstruction effort. You build up like medicine and engineering, Mr. Speaker. We think like those issues are peaceful measures in terms of like getting involved into combating terrorism, but that's not military issue, which brings direct resentment, and that's a clear line of distinction there. But let's talk about political aspect and political capital of Japan. Like Yuki tried to like charm his way into being Japanese and said that all people in Japan are happy with Abe Shinzo militarizing and arming their country again. We think you are getting it wrong, Yuki, because the fact of the matter is that it's also a very controversial matter within Japan. And when Japan tried to like reconstruct their constitution in terms of collective self-defense, there were massive backlashes from Japanese people, Mr. Speaker. So when you take a step and take an aggressive step into arming your military and to sending and actually waging war against those countries, we think that Abe Shinzo, this controversial issue, will be further strengthened, and Abe Shinzo will lose political capital into utilizing them into what's really necessary for Japan at the moment. Moreover, the public support that they talked about are public support for rescuing people and sending rescue missions to send abducted people. Rescue missions are absolutely different from waging wars, Mr. Speaker. We don't think that Japanese people have public support for waging war. They have public support for protecting their civilians, which is absolutely different, as I've explained throughout my speech, from waging war against ISIS. Third argument as to why this freezes the diplomatic relations and brings devastating results to Northeast Asia in general. First thing I'm going to explain to you why China and Japan, or China and Korea rather, will be much more threatened by this action. For three reasons. Firstly, we have more historical context and unique historical background of Japanese colonization. For example, Mr. Speaker, South Korean people are really angry about those comfort woman issues, as you would probably know. And like things like Nanjing genocide in China. That's what makes Chinese people and Korean people get mad about Japanese diplomatic relationship regarding unique historical context. They react really sensitively. Secondly, it's about territorial dispute that's unresolved even now. For example, Takeshima Dokdo Islands, Senkaku/Taoida Islands. Like when China is already acting sensitively, China will become more interventionist upon Japan and send out warships against Senkaku Islands for that matter, for that territorial dispute. But finally, because Abe Shinzo's political characteristic is a far right-wing character in that they support nationalism, because of Abe Shinzo's political color, China and Korea are really sensitive about these issues in general. So when there was an action of collective self-defense and the discussion of changing their constitution, South Korean media were on fire and said that this was Japanese right to wage war. And when these people are really sensitive about these issues, the result coming from Korea and China will be it freezes diplomatic relations, but moreover, it will create a massive arms race in Northeast Asia, which brings up tension and devastates the relation between these countries. And obviously, in that trade-off, Korea and South Korea and China is more important of a diplomatic partner compared to places like Syria, Mr. Speaker. That's why it's both politically and in terms of security, a horrible strategy for Japanese government we're proud to oppose.
732. All right, thank you very much, Mr. Opposition Leader. We call the Deputy Prime Minister.
Ladies and gentlemen, basically the major case coming from side opposition is this, that if you stop being a coward, if you go and say, oh, we're against you, ISIS, we're going to receive more threat from ISIS, and therefore you stay as a coward, not do anything, allow citizens to continue harm by other terrorist organizations, not just ISIS, but also other terrorists, so they can stay safe by not doing anything. We don't really believe it's true. But more than that, we believe that they were actually not engaging with the major case that came out from Yuki. Because Yuki's major case was this. They believed that regardless of its effectiveness, first and foremost, Japan has a right to arm itself and defend its national security, to defend its civilians. We believe that that was not engaged by Junbin at all. And therefore, we believe that by defense already won the debate. But I'm still going to engage with what they said about threats, right? Firstly, they say, hey, ISIS has no reason to attack Japan to begin with. We say that is not true. Not just because ISIS is randomly attacking lots of countries, but more because ISIS already perceives Japan as an ally. USA is an ally that goes against ISIS. Junbei's entire argument is predicated on the fact on how ISIS perceives Japan. And that's why Yuki's POI is very important. Because we told you that Japan is already funding billions and billions of dollars into the operations against ISIS right now. ISIS is not stupid. They can already see that money is going into against them. And that's why they already have the perception that Japan is against them right now. So what opposition is asking for now is Japan to withdraw at this moment. We do not believe that withdrawal at this moment is going to help at all, but for this perception as well. But more than that, we also say civilians outside country. Just because it's a photographer doesn't mean that you have no duty to protect the civilians. Just because we believe that even if it's an armed war or whatnot, Japan still have a duty to protect citizens outside its country. That's what embassies are for to begin with. What they say is basically this: because ISIS is far away, if the civilians go to the region around there, they deserve to die. Japan has no duty to protect them. We do not believe that that is principally justified. But second, they say what Junmin told me was that, oh, allies would help. If allies have help, Kanji wouldn't probably be dead right now. The fact is, a lot of times, these allies have no incentive to save the hostages of other nations. And then Junmin said this, we don't need army to save hostages. No, we need army to save hostages, because you need army to attack these hideouts to find out where these hostages are and to kill the people that holding these hostages to begin with. Therefore, an army is crucial in defending citizens outside their country. But more than that, I believe that what ISIS did when it makes a statement against Japan is a de facto declaration of war. We believe that there are cases where ISIS can attack Japan even in its domestic circuit as well, given how ISIS already perceives Japan when it comes to how Japan is funding the operations already. Therefore, we see a threat is already existing, and even if ISIS itself is not a threat, there are lots of other threats in the world as well. We believe that Japan has a right to defend itself. There is no case whatsoever on why Japan does not have the right to start with and why Japan does not have the duty to start with, and I believe that on both terms we already want to debate. But secondly, what I told you, the second issue was this, that public sentiments are actually against war. We say that is not true. Just saying that, oh, public is against it and not for it doesn't really attack the argument itself. Because what Yuki told you were reasons on why Japan actually right now supports military actions. But also more than that, that even if what Chung said was true a year ago, it's not true anymore. Because after the hostage incident, a lot of Japanese now are blaming the government for not being able to do anything. And a lot of them blame on the fact that because Japan does not have an army, there's no tool in the toolbox for Japan to do anything at all. Therefore, I believe the public sentiments right now have turned its tides, even if Chung said was true 1 year ago. And this is because they believe now, and they also agree, that we need offensive operation ability in order to defend our country. But lastly, what Chung said was this, oh, we have to look at these Northeast Asian perceptions. Again, you have to first engage with what Yuki told you in speech already. Because Yuki told you that we are now giving a chance for Japan to prove itself for its armies. And the war is probably not going to happen because they already have a lot of trade deals and because of what Yuki told you already. But the important question to ask ourselves is this. Is it true that Northeast Asian relationships are good right now? We don't think so. It's already tense. The question is, how do we change it for better? I believe that that's why Yuki's analysis is important. Because even the best case scenario of Jungbin's analysis, it stays the same. Things are as tense as ever. On our side, we actually give a chance for Japan to prove itself. When war does not happen after Japan has an army, this is when tourists in China or tourists in South Korea lose its stance. This is when people cannot say, hey, the reason why Japan is not attacking us right now is simply because we have an army. Now they have to say, even if Japan has an army, they're not attacking us. And that is why Yuki's analysis is important. But more than that, we also believe it's important because now Japan can interact with China and South Korea on terms of equal footing. This is when you both an army and you have a sense of deterrence. This is when I believe China and South Korea will have a case to actually take a softer stance. This is why, especially when it comes to case of disputes over islands between China and Japan, we believe this is where China will actually take a much softer stance comparatively. We believe that is actually beneficial for its long-term relationship. We believe what's going to happen is that in the short term, perhaps, even in the best case scenario, there may be a bit more tense relationship, but war's not going to happen based on what we have told you already. But in the long term, when Japan has that chance to prove itself that war's not going to happen even without army, that is when the relationship has a chance to occur. We do not believe that Jungbei's analysis on arms race is going to happen either, because his arms race argument is based on the fact that we're actually going to attack each side. If having more soldiers on Japan's side or on China's side, if they were not going to war with each other, but rather going against these terrorists, is a good thing as well, even if arms race will happen on that perspective. But before that, yeah.
So, by your logic, you say like having weapons increases the trust because it shows I'm unlikely to use my weapons. So if I have more and more weapons, won't that also increase people's trust?
Yeah. I just told you that even if we have more soldiers and weapons, it doesn't really matter if those weapons and soldiers are not used against another country. But the point is this. You need a case to prove yourself, and you're not getting that in the status quo. It's not about just having armies, it's about how you can prove the way of using the army to begin with. But now, onto the actual piece of constructive, and that's about how we actually facilitate international cooperation. Because what happens right now with lots of these terrorist operations, or anti-terrorist operations, is that lots of countries simply have how to go against these terrorists by themselves. Because a lot of time, there's no huge broad of willing powers. What happens if, say, the case of Mali was that France going in itself? What happened with the case of Jordan was that Jordan went in itself? Not a lot of countries are willing to go against these terrorist organizations. What happens when you have an extra country that's the rhetoric, that's the burden, that's the duty to actually go in? What happens is that you get one extra country to send armies with it. What happened in the case of Rwanda was that even though Japan was able to give money towards going against the Rwanda tribes, what happened was that no country was going to send troops there, so the money was lost. Only when Japan itself can send army as well, that is when UN decisions make sense to Japan, because now Japan can actually enforce that decision. Japan is now also an implementator. That is when Japan is more willing to engage with other kinds of international cooperation, because Japan now also has the ability to realize that decision. Right now, Japan can simply be giving money and not realizing these decisions. first resulting in pessimism and also looking down on Japan by other countries as well. What we have proven today is that first and foremost, Japan has the right and duty to protect its citizens, not engage for some opposition, but more than that, believe that it's better in terms of defending Japan, in terms of Northeast Asian relationship, and in terms of satisfying public sentiments. Very proud to propose. Thank you very much.
7-12. All right, thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister. We call the Deputy Leader.
Too many conflicts around water. I find it quite troubling that the government team's rhetoric here reminds me a lot about ISIS rhetoric, actually. Let's not be cowards. We need to retaliate. Rise up against the oppression that we have faced and come and strike your enemy with huge vengeance. We think that rhetoric is only going to increase. And that's the world that we don't like to have on this side of the house. We don't see this international condemnation towards Japan, Mr. Speaker. On our side of the house, we like Japan very much. We think the pacifism, the approach that Japan has showed towards building ties and trade is what the rest of the world needs to do. We think that that actually has lent Japan far more credibility. The reason why Japan has such good trade relationships with the rest of the world is maybe because Japan does not have this army, and because the fear of Imperial Japan has been clouded and removed once and for all. And if anything, they want to bring it back. And we're quite proud. If being a coward means resisting going into a war and killing people, then we think we're happy to be cowards on this side of the house. I'm going to talk about Japan's right to defend itself, which actually Junbin did respond to, which Democrats didn't. And then talk about whether or not Japan would be safer, which we think is the bulk of this debate. And then talk about what the position in Northeast Asia is going to be, a place I feel very strongly about, especially given that I live here. I'm also going to talk about then pacifism and the role of Japan as being a great diplomat in the world. And I think this will also engage Samuel's important extensions and contribution about why we need to evolve, to intervene to resolve crisis. Firstly, this notion of Japan's right to resolve itself. This was Junbin's first point. He said there's no clear threat to Japan. If you can show that Japan is under attack, then Japan already has the ability under that article to defend itself. So that's not part of the debate, if that's what you want to run. But secondly, we said that, then the point is also there to show that it is not just about whether any country has any right to do anything to itself. You need to contextualize to this situation, because otherwise you're just defending any right of any country to have an army. We also say it's not really about Japan's right to save hostages, which is this thing which they keep running about. Japan needs to be able to get in and to intervene. This is not a debate about rescue operations, Mr. Speaker. It's which they also did concede when they said that we will join and intervene in any other conflict, right? So it's not just about this one particular situation, and if it's about that intervention, it's already too late. Secondly though, and this is the bulk of the thing, what is the impact of this? Will Japan be safer or not be safer? And we think we provided a lot of analysis here, which was ignored. It makes Japan a legitimate target of ISIS. It denies their deniability, removes their plausible deniability, and throws them in head-on into this conflict. They said that, no, they know that Japan already gives money to Egypt and all these other countries, right? And on that basis, Japan has already made themselves a target. We said that, look, if what you're saying is that ISIS considers you giving money partly complicit, then now you sending troops on the ground is going to make you even more complicit. That's your analysis. But we said there's also a huge distinction between countries giving development aid and countries sending soldiers. Now, Japanese soldiers will have blood on their hands from killing innocent civilians, right? Because the American drone attacks and all of those things will eventually kill people. Japan will fall under the rhetoric of the great Satan that goes around and kills this child. You just need one graphic image of a dead child as a resultant of a Japanese bombing. And then Japan becomes a huge full-on partner of the American war on terror, Mr. Speaker. And we say there is a huge distinction between what Japan is doing now, between that and that is what we want to prevent, right? And we say that even if you think today's world, no tactics is dangerous, the world that you are proposing is going to be so much more dangerous, and we don't want to go there. Finally, this notion of Northeast Asia, we thought they were very, very flippant about this. And honestly, quite strange logic. Japan doesn't bully its neighbors. The neighbors this was Yuki's analysis, trust Japan, they love Japan because we can buy cheap products, Japanese items and stuff, and there's also the pornography, and all these things are really, really great. But then Samuel said, no, wait, look, there's tension, but we need to prove ourselves by getting an army. People don't trust us now because we don't have an army. But when we have an army, people will trust us even more. We think this is ridiculous. We think what we don't, that will be the last thing that people trust. Because even under a situation where Japan doesn't have an army, when the Japanese Prime Minister insists on visiting the Yasukuni every year and pledging to the war criminals that exist in the past, that riles people up. People still use it as an excuse to build army. That's still China's excuse to unilaterally impose an air zone. If now Japan says, I'm going to start combating terror, what if they want to combat terror in Southeast Asia? There will be a huge conflict and a rise against that issue. Yes, Vicky?
When they specifically announced the war on ISIS, and ISIS has said in their video that Japanese citizens will continue to be targeted to Iran. Is that not a real threat for Japanese citizens?
That is not a real threat towards the nation of Japan, right? And that is not a real threat towards the country of Japan being attacked. But even if you say that is the beginning of a threat, putting Japanese soldiers on the ground, you must concede, will only increase this threat. And then if you think that that's an effective way to do it, we ask you how, and I raise this as a point of information, how this will affect other countries that are involved in the war on terror. Australians now regret the involvement in their war, Mr. Speaker. A war which they say they brought into their home ground, not a war which they were necessarily involved in the start. And this is where we think that the world needs to change and a move towards more pacifism. Within Japan is an international, a diplomat and an ambassador for peace. What they do harms the Japanese ability to be a neutral mediator in these situations, which is important globally, which is important in Northeast Asia, which is important in Southeast Asia. We think generally we need more pacifism and less militarism. We think what they do, their rhetoric, justifies ISIS and their militants. The people who join this war on ISIS, Mr. Speaker, don't say I'm going to become a terrorist. They say I'm going to go to defend my nation against intervention, right? You can be an Australian, you can be a Korean even, and you will join this war because you feel some kind of pressure and oppression. And that's exactly the kind of rhetoric that they are encouraging the world to pick up. And we say that's not what we want. If Samuel is concerned about Boko Haram, is concerned about Rwanda, then what we need is to improve the lives of the people in that situation, not say we will put more troops on the ground. Has Mali become a safer place, Mr. Speaker? It has not, because you put more troops on the ground and you can bomb those places from above. What we need is more engagement on that ground. What we need is people saying that the solution is not with the military. And what we've seen in the last, because of the accident of this article in the Constitution, is Japan has become an incredible ambassador for cultural exchange, for negotiation, for building building relationships through trade and building and developing nations. And we think that's the path forward. We're proud to support on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, pacifism as a positive approach. And we think that's what the world needs. Not more United States of the Americas, Mr. Speaker, but more republics of Japan. Right? And we think that's the motion forward. So at the end of the day, the debate is not just about what any country can do in any situation, but what are the impacts of those choices. And we say the impact will be a less safe Northeast Asia and a less safe world. For those, we're very happy to oppose.
Excuse me, I'm really sorry. Can I go pee?
I'll give you like a minute and a half before I tell the speaker.
Was this recording?
We'll use my cup.
In bubble. Right here.
You'll hardly notice it if you know what I mean.
I forgot.
Hope he washes his hands.
Don't shake hands either after.
No,
Yeah.
Not until you're there.
Not touching you.
Elbows, elbows.
Okay.
There we go.
Hey, look at your time with it. We now call the government whip. Jesus, you're taking your time.
Okay, can I start?
Oh, I don't know. I think we should. Let's go get a sandwich first. Go!
At the end of the day, what the government wants to bring to you is change, right? Even if it's marginal, if we can protect at least one more innocent civilian, if we can at least to an extent have certain tools that the Japanese government can explore in order to save these citizens and have a much more better rhetoric in combating international terrorism, which I'm going to prove to you is a legitimate threat to Japan, that you cannot simply say geographic proximity is enough reason, we think we're better, right? Because coming from the opposition, what changes in the status quo? Nothing. Exactly what they're talking about, Japan's passiveness, the passive aggressiveness of still allying with the USA, giving them financial support, but somehow being absorbed of this military issue itself and going on the hands-down approach does nothing in the status quo. It does not in any way involve better rescue of hostages. It doesn't involve in any way better combating of terrorism, right? But before moving on to my clashes, basically three rebuttals that don't fit in, right? Firstly, they talk about that, Logan's entire speech, the one image, the one propaganda you have in Japan's associated with the USA, and that's it. That's the end of the world. We think coming from the government, it is problematic when everyone in the free world concedes that what ISIS is doing is fundamentally wrong, but you choose not to get involved with it. We think we have the Geneva Accords, we think we have international law and human rights for a reason, right? That even if it does not directly involve your citizens, that you still have an imperative to be responsible to uphold those moral responsibilities. If Japan in that case needs to be associated with the things that the USA is doing, we tell you number one, that's not always the case, because now you have military power, you're more of a legitimate actor to actually see how these operations work out rather than simply providing them money. But secondly, if that's what it takes for Japan to actually retaliate and go against international terrorism, so be it. But secondly, who exactly is ISIS, right? Who exactly are these terrorist organizations? We think that Yuki did a fine enough job in telling you that they are not prone to negotiations, right? Why is that? They have a very extreme fundamentalism ideology that they try to wage against the free world, right? Furthermore, they're extremely militarized. They have a military cult within their own organization that is not prone to diplomatic talks, right? Which is why in status quo we see so many of them failing. The entire opposition's arguments are predicated that ISIS will somehow be able to rationally negotiate with these governments and press reasonable charges. You only have negotiations when two sides can concede to an outcome and are able to concede and negotiate, right? To give up some of their claims in order to have the greater good. But in the case of terrorist organizations, we don't see that happening, right? But thirdly, does status quo change or does it not change? Coming from opposition, essentially, you do not see a change. You don't see combating of terrorism happening when this ideology is spreading through all countries, right? So basically, my first clash, who better combats terrorism? Basically, who does ISIS hate, right? Firstly, they talk about this no clear threat because Muslim fundamentalism isn't as much as relevant in Northeast Asia, and there's a geographic proximity. We tell you that when you look at ISIS, there are two types of recruits that they actually have. One, Muslim fundamentalists, yes, but also non-Muslim fundamentalists within that opt into it, right? Why do they go into ISIS? Because they necessarily concur with the extremist ideologies, the oppressive ideologies that ISIS actually portrays, right? Which is why we saw a South Korean guy actually opting into ISIS, wanting to go recruit, right? Simply telling us that Muslim fundamentalist does not exist within Northeast Asia, does not absolve that you can give rise to these sort of rhetoric and justification of ISIS within this region, right? But furthermore, we think that ideological warfare is as harmful as simply military combat, right? Which is why we see Australia also trying to opt into combat people within your country thinking that this is a legitimate form of school, right? But furthermore, we don't think geographical proximity matters in this case. We're talking about hostages. Unless you want to restrict the freedom of movement of every single one of your citizens, you still need to take care of this issue. But they talk about that. If we really do need to tackle it, let's ask the allies for assistance. We tell you that number one, there is no incentive. But furthermore, you already told us that there's higher threat if you involve yourself within tackling ISIS. So what incentive do these allies have to protect you, predicated on your arguments, right? But we also tell you there's no higher threat just because you're involved in it. Why is that? Because who does ISIS wage war against? The entire free world, right? They wage it against the ideology, perception, rather than targeting individual states. But even if they target individual states, we've already told you that Japan is associated with the US and with these allies because of their financial contribution, right? Brings me to my second point. Financial contribution versus militarization. Somehow the opposition is okay with financial contributions, telling us that you can build infrastructures, that you can somehow help these people, right? We don't think combating international terrorism is necessarily about building infrastructure, right? We think that is simply post-conflict wars, but right now it's in the middle of conflict itself, right? We don't think that going building houses for ISIS or going building like some sort of infrastructure for these terrorist organizations or these places in any way helps them. Furthermore, it's now mutually exclusive, right? Just because you militarize your own country does not mean you cannot give financial assistance as well, right? Although that will be to a certain extent limited. But we tell you that militarizing does unique things, right? One, it legitimizes the course of action that Japan actually takes. But secondly, it allows Japanese government to have a better toolbox in actually addressing the problems, right? Brings me to my second clash, Northeast Asia, before that.
So is your argument right now that America, the largest army in the world, doesn't have enough tools to destroy ISIS?
Very fair.
We tell you that this is not about whether or not we completely destroy ISIS, but does it allow the Japanese government to some extent make better decisions because they have the capacity to explore more possibilities, right? So moving on to my second clash, Northeast Asia. They basically told us that it freezes diplomatic issues based on two predicates, right? First, historical grievances. We think there are two problems in status quo. One, that you don't allow a progression of rhetoric that we hate Japan. We think it allows even Japan to be radicalized, right? Because you're being blamed consistently for historical grievances that you don't necessarily associate to, which brings the second problem, that there is a domestic polarization in Japan itself, right? We think it worsens when you don't give legitimacy to remilitarize because you're not able to, out of order, not willing to take part in the war against terrorism itself, right? But we already told you, you have a chance to prove yourself peaceful. Why is that? Because now you need to cooperate with USA, South Korea, and China for a common enemy, right? So I tell you there are much bigger common enemies than simply the historical grievances that the current generation does not succumb to, right? But furthermore, the second point was arms race. We tell you that number one, the entire hub of arms race is that you are necessarily targeting each other. The entire peacefulness of Japan that they base their trade talks onto is the assumption that Japan still has the motivation to colonize the rest of their neighbors, right? Which you don't think is the status quo when you talk about free trade agreements. It's not only because they're peaceful, but because they moved on from the colonization aspect, right? But we need a question, is this arms race good or bad? We think when these countries are united against a common enemy, against international terrorism, this arms race is not necessarily a bad thing when you're not targeting each other. And we've already told you, if you think free trade, if you think Japan is peaceful and therefore can conduct free trade, then why not allow a chance to prove itself and disprove the rhetoric coming from Northeast Asia? Fundamentally proud to propose.
7:37. Okay, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Alright, we call the opposition motion.
Can't believe my organized papers. Mr. Speaker, basically the proposition case is equivalent of masturbation. We want to do it, it will make us feel good, but technically it won't do anything. It's not the real thing. It's basically what we call a meaningless endeavor. We think that the problem that we have here, the moment that the whip speaker comes up and says that eventually we want change. You want change, but the real question is, will you change anything for the better? Second, they also said, one more life saved is good enough for us. then you immediately come into the flame that this is a comparative utilitarianism. Then if we have one person say, but at the cost of hundreds of people being additionally targeted and endangered and killed, you already lose. Thank you. Our problem with the debate is simple. We think that the whole notion that Japan wants to do things, unless they have some kind of secret super robot that they never revealed, is meaningless. The effort to fight terror